Welcome. Today we're sitting down with two experts from WSA, Dr. Sheena Burks, Chief Clinical Officer, Dr. Branda, Head of Audiology and Research. Today we're going to be discussing the realities that VA audiologists face every day, some of their biggest pain points, and what's next in the world of hearing care, both inside and outside of the VA. So let's start with a little bit about you both. Dr. Burks, tell us a little bit about your background, your role, and what drew you to focus on research and VA audiology.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having us. I've been an audiologist for almost 30 years, both involved in direct patient care, but then also working on the industry side from a manufacturing perspective. And I would say, as I think about working specifically with veterans, it reminds me of my experience working with children in the pediatric population. You might think those are so very different, but the reality is they're actually very similar. Oftentimes you're dealing with populations that have very complex audiological needs, sometimes comorbidity, so other things going on outside of in addition to their hearing loss. And so it really becomes about how do we find solutions and technologies that are really solving those challenges that they have. And so that's what attracted me specifically at Signia to really focus on that, because they are unique needs and being able to look at it through a technological perspective was important.
No, great. Thanks for sharing that. And Dr. Branda, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you to this field?
Yeah, I've been an audiologist for over 25 years and have spent most of my career in industry in roles such as audiology support, customer training, product management. And it's a really fascinating place to be to look at how the technology can evolve, which is what drives a lot of what I like about working with the VA population, because you get some really special needs. A lot of things such as Dr. Burks had mentioned is, they've got unique challenges. I mean, the military background, types of hearing loss, tinnitus. And I love that we can bring the technology to them to really help make their day-to-day easy to hear.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and how do they compare to a private practice setting?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think first, if we just look at audiologists as a whole, there's a lot of research out there that looks at what are some of the top stressors for audiologists. And there's things like time constraints and administrative burden. And so when you put that in the context of a VA audiologist, it just becomes amplified. I mean, these audiologists are really like unsung heroes. They're seeing patients back to back throughout the course of the day. And then they have the added administrative burden of what they need to do to document. This is the military, it's government. And so all of the documentation that's required takes a lot of time. So it's a lot.
So it's such a critical factor, right? And time can really get everyone backed up and not seeing the patients in the flow that they'd like to. And where do you think that they lose that time? Where in their workflow?
It's such a good question. I think it comes from a few areas. I'm looking at it through the lens of a manufacturer. But one of the challenges is because they have these patients back to back, many of these veterans have traveled for hours to get their appointments. If they receive hearing aids that are, we say dead on arrival, they're not working, or perhaps they didn't arrive on time, all of a sudden it becomes a domino effect. So it doesn't just impact that one patient in front of them, but now they're backing up their whole day. And so it's really about how can we be intentional as manufacturers to make sure that we're not, one, disrupting that process, but then also are there things that we can do proactively to kind of take some of the stress out of the process that they're already working under.
Yeah, exactly. I would assume that first fit is really important in a situation like that.
Absolutely.
Great. So let's talk a bit about the veterans themselves. We hear that veterans often do what they say, I do fine one-on-one in a small group conversation, but then when I get out into a larger group at dinners, that's when they start having those hearing challenges. Why do you think that those situations are more challenging for veterans, and why does this make it, a more critical issue to address?
So, if we come right down to the nature of the hearing loss, I mean, hearing loss typically, especially for our veterans, affects the higher frequencies, kind of if you think the treble on your stereo system. And what that means is they'll hear the power of speech, the vowels, they'll hear that piece coming through, but the clarity, the intelligibility, it sounds like people are mumbling. They don't hear those S's, those T's, those P's. So those sounds are lost. Fortunately, those sounds are very visible. So for that one-on-one conversation, so if I'm talking to you one-on-one, I can focus on you. The sounds I might not be hearing, I would get from your lips, and I can piece it together. Our brains do that very well. But if we take that into a multi-talker conversation, so if I'm talking to you and all of a sudden Dr. Burks has something to say, I probably missed the beginning of that communication. I've missed an initial piece. I'm turning there and then I'm trying to catch up. You're going to have something to say. It gets more difficult. Add noise on top of that. So now that's even covering up those sounds that I'm still trying to make out and starting to affect other sounds I'm having trouble with. It becomes very difficult. And here's where I look at where the technology can jump in to really supplement that. Because we'll look at, if it was just noisy, I could have directional microphones focused on the person in front of me, but then I'd still have to turn to talk in a group conversation. We have introduced real-time conversation enhancement, so I can use these multiple beams. So even if I'm looking at you, if she starts talking, I've got another beam that'll pick her up. I won't miss that onset of the speech, and I then know she's talking, and I can then turn and still have a beam looking at you. So I can follow that group conversation and not miss a lot of those important speech cues. The technology will help me do that.
In speaking on that, when Signia is looking to develop technology for the VA, and you talked a little bit about that, what's the starting point? Is that, the technology features, or is it understanding the workflow realities? So, how do you make a solution that actually works for the VA?
So I think we look at different teams that can do that, because first, as we're designing a hearing aid, we're looking at what are the requirements for that hearing aid? What does it need to do? And very importantly, we make sure that included in those requirements are what our veterans would need. So what is going to be important, whether it's looking at how to amplify those high frequencies, those directional mics, which are still going to be important for the general population as well. We'll look at getting those in, but also maybe something special like a SCIF, where I need to turn off wireless communication in the hearing aids. That becomes a requirement for our VA population. So we try to put that in there as well. And in the same time, our software teams are looking at how do we make the smoothest, most efficient software flow. And we test and work together to really bring a cohesive system to bring to our VA government services groups.
The other thing I would add to what Eric said is I think we are very intentional about taking an outside-in approach. I think it's very easy sometimes when you work on the industry side to be in our ivory tower and think of all these great things we can do with technology, but not really understanding what does this mean for the patient, or even what does it mean for the audiologist that has to fit these products. And for us, it's exactly what Eric said about really understanding where people are struggling, where there are opportunities to do better, right? And so that's that outward approach, outside approach that we take and then internally say, how do we solve this? And that's, he talked about real-time conversation enhancement. That's a really great example of that.
Yeah, that's so important to have that listening first mindset when you're designing, or even just when you're making those recommendations. So both to the audiologist and the patient. Great. So let's talk a little bit about the future of VA audiology and maybe just audiology in general. So Eric, what are the broader trends that you're seeing, and what do you think will shape VA audiology going forward, 5-7 years from now?
I think some of the things we see are, looking at how we keep those efficiencies going and trying to make it, again, easier on the patient as well as the audiologist. So things like teleaudiology, so we can do remote fittings. Those, they take away travel time. They make it easier that somebody doesn't always, have just getting from the car to the office might be difficult for somebody. So when you can do remote fittings, that helps simplify things and just build in, again, an efficiency. And then we look at where technology is going. AI has been a big trend in hearing care, and that is only going to grow in terms of what the hearing aids can do using things like deep neural networks, DNNs, and looking at what we can also just do clinically. How does AI contribute to the clinical practice so that, again, we can be more efficient? Let's say don't spend time on taking notes when it can be done for you via an AI system. So let's look at what technology help us help the patient more quickly.
Well, thank you both so very much for joining us today. Dr. Sheena Burks, Dr. Eric Branda, thanks for sharing your insights on really what gets to the heart of VA audiologists and helping veterans. So we can't wait to hear what's next from Signia.